Hey, good morning. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We are excited about the panel that we have um, talking about governing and the challenges and the excitement around winning, and not only elections and policy changes. We're going to give folks a couple of minutes to trickle in, but we're really excited that folks are here with us on this Saturday morning. So welcome. So for folks that are joining us, we are talking about governing, particularly in Virginia. We do a lot of work around elections and making sure that we get folks who understand our communities, understand our values, who care about the problems and the issues that our folks are facing, and then want to offer up solutions and work together in partnership to change our world and our communities and make them better. And it's not always easy, right? Governing is really hard because there are lots of dynamics at play and there's lots of challenges that come with it. And we're really excited that you all are joining us this morning. Virginia has been at the center in many ways of a national conversation around transformative change and what it could look like if you put in the work and roll up our sleeves and engage people in a meaningful way and build new political homes for people to acknowledge that they are seen and heard. And if you do that work, you could really change the political landscape. And over a series of elections, and Virginia is one of those places where we are lucky and we are cursed in some ways that we have elections every year, which basically means we get no break, right? But it also helps us to understand and realize that elections are never the finish line, that the work is ongoing, and that it matters what happens after November. And so when we think about elections, it's really, we answer the question for ourselves, like, to what end? Why is it so important that we elect champions and people who actually care about our communities and who wanna make change? This year, 2020, I know it's a challenging year for all of us, and many of us want to just fast forward and see it end. But we have a lot of work to do before we can wrap this up, y'all. There's a lot of work we have to do in 2020. But I will say that we entered this year really excited. And we entered this year with a Democratic trifecta for the first time in Virginia since 1993. And that didn't happen overnight. That happened after years and years and years of hard work. Many of the folks on this panel that you're going to hear from this morning were a big part of that sweeping change. Folks who aren't on this panel, everyday folks, were a big part of that sweeping change. And it was exciting, right? Because we thought about all the possibilities of what it could look like to have a trifecta, not only in our executive office and our executive branch and Governor Northam, but in our state Senate and our state House, and all the possibilities of what that could look like. And I think, a couple of us were like, well, are we gonna have to temper our expectations? We can't have all the things that we want overnight. Like some of the change is gonna have to be, incremental, and it might have to happen over time. And so we wrestled with that, right? And that's what we mean when we say that governing is really complicated, and you have to take into a lot of factors. So this morning we're going to hear from folks who are at the front line of both the inside strategy and the outside strategy around these significant policy wins. So first we'll hear from Senator Jennifer McClellan. She has earned a reputation for having and being an effective constituent-oriented legislator. She has represented the greater Richmond area. She is actually my state senator, so I'm excited that she's here with us today. She's been in the House of Delegates for 11 years and in the Senate for 4 years. She has led the fight on passing laws around education, expanding access to healthcare, to ban discrimination and inequity. She has been at the forefront of fights on reproductive justice and climate change here in the Commonwealth. And she recently announced that she is running for governor to be the first Black female governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. So that's very exciting. Then we'll hear from Delegate Price, who was just reelected for her third term in the House of Delegates. She represents the 95th District down in Hampton Roads. She currently serves on the Health, Welfare, and Institutions Committee, the Privileges and Elections Committee, and the General Laws Committee. And she is chair of the Behavior Health Subcommittee. So there's a lot of committees where a lot of big policies kind of go through. Not only is she in the state legislature, she also serves as the director of the Virginia Black Leadership Organizing Collaborative, which is an organization that builds and empowers Black communities throughout Hampton Roads and Newport News. Maya Castillo is the political director for New Virginia Majority, where she uses her experience in policy, in elections, and in organized labor to really ensure that everybody has a role in building our democracy and making sure that our voices are heard. She leads some of our largest, actually our largest, electoral field campaigns, and really understands how to translate the electoral victories into accountability work with our elected officials. She hails from Arizona, where she was a part of SCIU and has really built a comprehensive understanding of engaging people of color. And then last but not least, we have Anna Scholl, who is the Executive Director of Progress Virginia, which is the progressive communications hub in the Commonwealth. Anna was raised in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, so the southwestern part of the state. She's worked on congressional campaigns, and then she went to DC and joined the Kennedy Communications, has done a whole lot of work around that, and then came back, thankfully, to Charlottesville and joined Progress Virginia as its founding executive director in 2011, and has really led the way on progressive narrative change for Virginia. So I'm going to direct the first question to Senator McClellan. Senator, you have been in the state legislature since 2006, first as a member of the House of Delegates, now as state senator. You've served in both the minority and the majority during both Republican and Democratic administrations. What are some of your biggest lessons learned when it comes to governing and getting things done?
Well, first, thanks, Tram. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. There's so many lessons, and I think the title of this panel kind of sums it all up. Making that shift from how do I convince people who don't agree with me to do what I want, to now there are people that agree with me, took some time. It's hard. I mean, you get used to, after 14 years of just being told no, to manage expectations and to think like, I can't go bold. And then you're like, oh wait, yes I can go bold. So that's the first lesson. The second is that the words and the work really matters. We had bills that my entire 14 years in the minority were introduced that either never got a hearing or got a summary hearing where you presented your side and they said, thank you very much, and then killed it. And you never actually looked at the words on paper. And sometimes when you have a bill that is written and you have to really dig in, you realize, wait a minute, this doesn't really do what I wanted it to do. This wasn't quite ready for prime time. And this is the first time we've really looked at it. And when you have a 60-day session, we had a record number of bills because we had 20 years of pent up demand on every issue. We ran out of time on a lot of bills where we had the will to get it passed, but we just couldn't get the words right. Then there is, and Marcia probably can give a little better insight on that, just leading people and managing committees. On the Senate side, we had been in the majority a few times before, and so kind of knew what to expect. You had people who had been committee chairs before. On the House side, there were only 2 members of the Democratic caucus who had ever been in the majority. So learning to be a committee chair, learning that process and managing staff and managing people, they had a brand new clerk, that took some time. And then on the Senate, when you're one of only 21 people, the workload was crushing. I'm on 5 committees, and I lost track of how many subcommittees, and just managing, there were days I literally had to be 4 places at one time, and just managing that crushing workload. And then finally, just remembering to savor some victories. We had a lot of bills where the first, take the Reproductive Health Protection Act. I remember coming in, being the first pregnant member of the House of Delegates, fighting against the ultrasound bill, fighting against the TRAP bill, just being devastated that we couldn't kill those bills. And then our first year in the majority to pass major legislation to repeal those bills, and just taking a moment to savor that victory, how long it took and how many people came along on the journey to get those bills passed. Sometimes you just got to take a moment to celebrate your victories. And then on other bills, when you can't go as far as you want to, celebrate how far you've come. And then as soon as session ends, get ready to go the rest of the way. So I think those were the biggest lessons learned.
Amen. We learned a lot. I think even us as advocates learned a lot in terms of how do you navigate and, interact with the majority, many of whom, have never been in the majority before. Yeah. Delegate Price, you not only serve as a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, but you also lead Virginia Bloc, as I mentioned earlier. So you probably understand more than most the concept of inside and outside strategies and how those two interplay with each other. Can you talk a little bit about that and why it's so important to have both?
Absolutely. So the inside won't function properly without the outside system, just because the system itself won't change without that pressure. And then realizing that the outside can't really co-create the vision that they have for a better, safer, more equitable future without policy changes from the inside. And so often this is a dysfunctional love-hate relationship. But I think a lot of the progress that Senator McClellan talked about that we got this year was because we did have a well-strategized relationship between the inside and outside, which allowed for better policies to be made with the input and ownership of that communal effort. And so in Virginia, the outside has organizations like New Virginia Majority and Progress Virginia and Virginia Bloc and others that are all badass for sure. And we have hard work. We're working in areas that are deeply impacted by the perpetuation of systems established in white supremacy. And so our organizing is in communities with multiple generations worth of justified distrust in said systems that is often misdiagnosed as apathy. And so it's a heavy lift to organize, where we are. And then on the inside, people like Senator McClellan and me, we have the audacity to take votes on the House or Senate floor in the same chair where someone else previously sat who voted to oppress, suppress residents based on gender, race, class, citizenship status, and sexual orientation. And it's not lost on me that I'm a woman whose perspective reflects the intersection of most of those categories. And so for some historical clarity also in Virginia, in 2016, Delegate LaSharice Aird and I became the 17th and 18th of now 19 Black women to ever serve in the House of Delegates. And that is out of the 401 years of this form of government's existence. And so much like Senator McClellan, I showed up in 2020 thinking that with a Democratic trifecta on the inside and amazing work being done to amplify and uplift BIPOC communities on the outside, that we were going to get all of the things done. And I was quickly reminded that a Democratic majority is not the same as a progressive majority. And when we were in the minority, there were things that all of us would fight against, but now that we were in power, some of the same people were not automatically fighting for the opposite. So say we were all together in fighting obvious injustice, but now some of them served as obstacles to proactively legislating justice. So there are two things I like to remind people about Virginia. Virginia may be blue, but it is not navy blue. We are periwinkle. And that nobody who ran and won in 2019 had a platform of like painfully slow, incremental, watered down, dreams deferred type change. Like we all talked about the big, bold, progressive values because they polled well, but then we didn't press hard to the full extent of those things once we got in power. And so we did get some change. For instance, you know, after years of collaborative work, you know, we have some champions and we got significant strides in democracy, economic justice, historic investments in public education, student debt reform, reproductive health care, and of course, the gun violence prevention measures that we got through. But most of it, if not all of it, had an asterisk of parts we didn't get. And so I just want to uplift that, you know, the folks here are like some of the most foundational elements to the success that we did get from the inside and the outside are the votes, organizing, and legislative work of women of color, period. Like women of color on the inside and outside are often the ones pushing for justice for everyone right now, no excuses. And yes, we really mean everyone. And women of color are the ones who show up and vote even when the candidates may not reflect our values. We are underfunded and undermined as candidates. We have to take time to teach our colleagues about lived experiences and systems of oppression. We speak up about intersectionality so that our bills won't leave like entire sections of our communities behind. And like, some of the topics that we tackled were often the ones that are doing the work that puts our own power, relationships, funding, and sometimes our lives at risk to push for what's right for our communities. And so this year we found ourselves fighting often with folks on our own side. And some of these Democrats stood firmly in the way of change. And we'll get to see if they've changed after the uprising in special session on police reform next week. But being a progressive on the inside and outside, like I'm in a position where I can see the daily disappointing and convoluted practices on the inside and the heart-wrenching need on the outside. So it's hard and exhausting and nonstop and overwhelming, like the senator said. But at some point, we also must address like how women of color are treated like workhorses, how our work is often stolen and people take credit for it, and then also the mental health toll that all of this takes. But then when we see the bills pass and we look up in the gallery and we see the advocates that we've been working alongside for years and years and years, just in full out tears because we got change that they never thought would happen, then it just re-energizes us to continue to fight on that inside and outside, because we cannot stop at anything less than our full freedom. And it's got to continue to be both inside and outside in order to get it.
As one of the advocates that probably stood in the gallery a couple of times this session in tears, and I admittedly do not cry and ever in public, and sometimes you just can't help it because, you know, the change that these policies are going to have on real people and real lives is overwhelming. And to actually be able to get some things done after years and years of struggle, you can't help but let the emotion carry you away. For folks that are attending, thank you so much for joining us. We're talking about you know, some of the challenges that we face even as we have more progressive champions elected into office, and you know what it takes to actually win on some policy changes. If you have any questions for any of the panelists, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A box, and I'll be monitoring that, and we'll get to that towards the end of the conversation. I'm gonna go to Maya next. Maya, as the political director for New Virginia Majority, you've had a front row seat in terms of, you know, creating and executing the plans that we have to create this current trifecta in the state, you know, looking at different elections and different races and really building year after year to have the landscape that we're in. And as we said earlier, the elections are just an inflection point. It's not the end of the road. And so can you talk a little bit about both the election side of things, but then also what we need to do after the elections to continue to engage voters and to continue to engage communities as we strive to win these policy changes?
Sure. So as much work as goes into winning in November, and for Virginians, and y'all know that is every single year. I may lose friends by saying this, but it's not ever about November. I know the impact in a single election can have, so I'm not dismissing that in any way, right? But whether or not a voter turns out has a tremendous impact on an election and on a community. So all of our electoral programs are most informed by people and by communities. When we talk to voters at New Virginia Majority, we're not just sharing a candidate. We're sharing ideas and we're sharing values. And we're, more importantly than that, we're asking questions and we're listening to the answers. So we're listening to common threads like education and healthcare access and violence and police. And we don't do that just to create these single shot messages. We're doing that to lift up our organizing and our advocacy work post-election. Voters show up for the things they need changed. And many voters still need to be invited into the process. It's always shocking to me, and I shouldn't be shocked anymore, but over 2 million doors knocked, and we still hear a voter say, no one has ever come to my door. And that's all during electoral season. But for me, what happens after the season is over, after the wins, after we've knocked all of those doors, is even more important. Campaign offices for individual candidates, they come and go, they close down, but we stay open. Within 2 weeks of November 5th of 2019, which I think about and it seems like 25 years ago, within 2 weeks of that day, we were contacting voters. We were back out, whether door knocking or phone calling, and getting back to all those people that we talked to about their issues and their communities and their families, just to check in, just to let them know who's gotten elected, give them contact information for their elected officials, sometimes new representatives, old representatives, all the updates. And I'll be honest, that was, there are definitely people who were annoyed. They're like, I thought we were done for a little while. I thought they would stop. But mostly we heard almost the same thing, like no one's ever knocked on our door before. It was, no one has ever called us back after election day. We didn't know we mattered after that. And we keep calling and we keep reaching out. We called folks and we let them know that legislative session was starting. We talked to voters on specific issues. Did they tell us that the most important issue for them was environmental justice? Well, we then contact them to let them know there's a bill, even though that bill is, just in committee, right? Where, we all have to be honest, so many bills go to die. We ask people to contact their representatives and to let them know that this one thing is important to them and their families. And sometimes that's shocking to some elected officials who in previous sessions maybe only heard from a handful of very plugged in people, maybe the same people over and over again. And so they're, kind of calling us back and saying like, why are people calling me about this one thing? And then we continue to contact people and we continue to include voters in conversations. We even started to contact folks when Virginia first started shutting down with COVID. We wanted to make sure they had solid information about the census, but we also were making sure that they had resources on food banks. They knew about unemployment options. Sometimes we even prayed with them on the phone, right? As they lost their jobs and people started getting sick. And so just, in that way, we attempted to contact like 500,000 Virginians over the past few months, and that's not even with our electoral season. That's outside of it. And this is, really important. We have to make these connections between the policy creation and the elections and move from, this electoral work into community organizing and ensuring that voters have, and not just voters, but all Virginians have a voice in what their Virginia looks like. So none of this happens in a vacuum, and we just have to keep ensuring that elected officials, but also just, everyday working people know that they're a big part of the process, and, that we take away that vacuum.
Oh, okay. So I think we lost Treya.
We lost our moderator.
But I know who was next. And, Senator McClellan, if you want to take over, let me know. But Anna, you and your work at Progress Virginia, I can speak on personally, and I know Senator McClellan can, like the work that Progress Virginia does in helping push back on false narratives, create the opportunity for us to tell our real narrative is just so integral when we're talking about inside-outside strategies. So tell us more about the work that you do and how it's important to this conversation.
Thank you, Delegate Price. So our work at Progress Virginia is really about sort of holding the home for communications and digital work for the progressive movement in Virginia and providing that support to our partners in movement building and building power and building progress. And it's about working in community to build the story of who we are and where we want to go as a Commonwealth. For a really long time in Virginia, the narrative has been about the so-called Virginia Way, which is really summed up as, proponents would tell you this sort of Southern genteel approach to governing. And in reality, it is an old white male approach to governing that is about preserving systems of power. And our job is to build the power of a new story in Virginia, where governing is about all of us, truly all of us, where no one is left behind, and where the most important voices are the people and communities across the Commonwealth who actually hold the power to make change. In Virginia, we are blessed and challenged to have a legislative session every year and an election every year. And that means that we don't ever have the luxury of not being on our game. We have to be incredibly intentional and thoughtful and forward-thinking about how we tie the work that we do in January in the legislature to the election in November and help voters understand the links between those two pieces and the power that they have to influence all of it. So one of the ways that we really center that work at Progress Virginia is through our Narrative Project, which is an initiative that we launched at the end of 2016 to really do deep listening work with voters and with our partners across the state on what do people in Virginia care about? How do they view their lives? What are the values that are most important to them? What are they hopeful about? What are they scared of? So that we can really support everyone in building stories that are about meeting people where they are and about talking to them about the things that they actually care about, not just what happens to test at the top of a poll in any particular election. And that means really centering our approach in our shared values, in the way that we view the world and relate to the world around us, and working with legislators, working within movement to have a unifying vision that ties together all of the work that we're doing. Because we all know that there is no one silver bullet that is going to magically get us to where we want to be. This is hard, long-term work. And we've had really great victories this year, right? And repealing restrictions on abortion access, increasing access to education, moving us towards a clean energy future, and so much more. But there is so much more work to do. And if we make the story that we are telling about where we're trying to go, about any one of those things, and not that final vision, then we're undermining our work, because we are in service of building a movement that is aspirational. And we want people to understand, okay, we've got Medicaid expansion, and here's the next things we have to do to get to this vision, because they are all connected. Nobody leads a single issue life. So we also really emphasize within our work centering the voices of people who are impacted, which means that storytelling is really core to our approach. If Progress Virginia is the organization that is like in the headlines and in the news all the time, that pretty much means that we're not doing our job right, because it's not about us. It's about the people who we are working with, working to amplify their voices and uplift their stories, because that's how we make policy impacts real. Everybody understands the world through their head, but also through their heart, which means the ability to tell really compelling, fully fleshed out stories about where we're trying to go, how we're going to get there together, and what it's going to look like for our families when we win is a key part of a winning strategy, which means that a key part of that is empowering people to tell their own stories through storytelling training, through lifting up their voices in the media, through pushing those stories to the forefront, and then arming legislators like Delegate Price and Senator McClellan to amplify those stories as well, and make sure that that's what we're talking about when we're talking about policy, when we're talking about passing legislation, or why elections are important. They're important because they're about people, and our role is really to make sure that people are always what we're talking about.
Thanks, Anna. And I apologize to folks. My power went out here, so I'm sitting in the dark, and I'm on my phone, so hopefully the service isn't terrible. But see, we have an amazing group of panelists who, kept it going. So thank you. I had suggested earlier that you all might get some tea on some of our favorite policy wins, and because I sort of absorb information best by example. I think I'm going to ask each panelist to give an example of a bold policy change that they're most proud of, and give us a sneak peek into what it took to actually get those policy changes. So I'll again start with Senator McClellan, if you want to talk about one of your favorite policy wins.
Yeah, so this one was hard. It's like, it's hard choosing your favorite child, but I had 49 bills this year, and it was because we had so many things that we'd been trying for so many years. But I think I'll pick the Reproductive Health Protection Act, because following up on Anna's point, the stories are so important. So when I first got elected to the House, I remember it was a very anti-choice majority in the House. And then when Republicans took over the House and the Senate, they passed anti-choice legislation, including the mandatory ultrasound bill, the TRAP laws. And I remember at the time, the first time the ultrasound bill made it to the floor, I was pregnant and knew pretty well how these bills impacted pregnant women and the relationship between them and their physician. Because when I went to my doctor to get my first ultrasound, which I knew was transvaginal, and my doctor actually said, let me tell you some practical, some of my cases where Virginia's abortion laws impacted my case. And I began telling those stories on the House floor, and then later on the Senate floor, and then working with partners in our reproductive health coalition, telling people stories in committee, in the press, wherever we could. and making it not a theoretical, where do you stand on reproductive health, but a practical, here's how they impact women's ability to make decisions that are best for them and access healthcare. So we knew, but it's, you know, Republicans also lie sometimes, and they can twist words to fit a narrative that they want. So in 2019, I carried in the Senate, and Kathy Tran carried in the House a very proactive, progressive bill to remove these barriers. And she was a freshman delegate and fell into a trap set by a career prosecutor who asked her a question that she answered in a way that was not accurate, but that became the story. And that became part of the campaign issues. And so when we were in the majority, we still had a lot of Democrats who were nervous about a bold, proactive reproductive health bill, especially in the Senate, where we only had a 1-seat majority, and we had a senator who was not 100% pro-choice. And so I knew, first, I need to make sure all of my colleagues understand practically how these laws have impacted women's access, particularly women of color and low-income women. So we had to tell their stories. They came in and told their stories in committee. And unfortunately, we knew that we did have to take one provision out of the bill just because it was a non-starter for that one senator. And if we wanted to get 20 votes and then have the lieutenant governor break the tie, the only way to do that, because there was one other member who didn't like that provision, we said, you know what, if we get 4 out of 5, we'll take that and we'll come back. And so I think, again, it took years and years of telling stories, of understanding how to talk about reproductive health beyond just theory and statistics, but real life examples of how they impact women. And we got that passed, and among other bills. I mean, I've got to say, it is also, to Delegate Price's point, it is critically important that you have our voices in the legislature, because you can count on one hand how many women have been pregnant while in office. And part of what we have to do is educate our colleagues on our experiences so that we can tell those stories. So I think that's the one I'm the proudest of. And we might have lost Tram again, so I'm I think next on the list is Marcia, and I hope that's right.
Thank you, Senator. And yeah, that I remember years and years of fighting.
So yeah, I'll jump in, and I think, you know, there is no surprise here for anybody on this panel that mine for this year would be redistricting. And I've really dug into this issue because I think independent and community-based redistricting is foundational to all of the other issues that we fight for. And I've worked with advocates, again, inside, outside game, for 4 sessions to try and pass a good criteria bill that would establish parameters for how fair districts should be drawn and to make gerrymandering a thing of the past. And for 3 years, it was killed on a party line vote in very early morning, you know, subcommittee meetings, much like, you know, was described, where it's just like you get to say hi to people and tell them about what your bill would have done, and then they summarily kill it. But that was done by the same group of legislators that were responsible for drawing 11 districts that were recently thrown out as unconstitutional racial gerrymanders. So, you know, this year there was the power shift, but there was also a pretty heated and contentious debate over my estimation of a flawed and hyper-partisan redistricting commission versus real reform. Virginia vote no on one. But as that debate raged, it was also clear that folks needed a situation where Democrats could all agree on something to highlight our unity. And we needed to also have a clear and unequivocal demonstration that we really did believe that gerrymandering was bad. And so we talked and talked, and eventually we could see an opening for a pretty progressive criteria bill. And we pressed to get basically everything we wanted in negotiations. And because of women's persistence, hard work, and more persistence, and the cosign of a white male professor that some of the older senators trusted, the words of the criteria bill were actually associated with all of the versions that dealt with redistricting commissions. So it was clear that no matter who was drawing the maps, we agreed on how they should be drawn. And as of July 1st of this year, racial, political, and prison gerrymandering were all made illegal in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And that's a pretty big deal. And most of us would have never thought that it would have happened, I think, so soon in the new power flip. But advocates helped with that work, like helping to cut to the meat of the issue and turning a pretty wonky and definitely not sexy issue into a main priority by like educating people on how it impacts them. And so it made it even easier for us to get that progressive win.
So I can jump in and talk about Medicaid expansion, which was not this year. Virginia finally passed Medicaid expansion in 2018, but it was a multi-year long fight. And I think it was really a learning experience as well, because when we all first started working to expand Medicaid in Virginia in 2012 and 2013, in retrospect, we took the wrong approach. And didn't understand that winning that massive policy change was fundamentally about who had the more compelling story to tell. And we were telling the wrong story. And we got caught up in the policy and the numbers and started out trying to convince people that Medicaid expansion is great because it's going to create jobs and bring money into communities and it's going to be good for hospitals. And none of that was about people. It didn't, resonate with people because it wasn't about what actually impacted their lives and their communities, while our opposition was telling a really scary story about like, this is just government trying to intrude into your life and tell you what to do. And when we first started advocating for Medicaid expansion, it was not overwhelmingly popular. I think there wasn't even a majority of Virginians who supported Medicaid expansion. And over the years, what we learned and what really led to a winning strategy was when we started talking about people and we changed our narrative from numbers and jobs and policy wonk language to these are the people who are struggling. These are the people who are dying because they don't have access to healthcare. And these are their stories. And fundamentally, what we were contesting for was not a high-level policy argument to change the minds of 10 or 20 people in the General Assembly. What we were contesting for were the hearts and minds of people across the Commonwealth to change their minds about Medicaid expansion, to build the power to get it done. And that work of changing our narrative to center those stories of people who were impacted, what it was like to struggle without healthcare access, is ultimately the change that led to shifts in public opinion, that led to our ability to get Medicaid expansion done. Because when we first started this fight in 2013, legislators weren't running on Medicaid expansion. It wasn't this big thing that was the centerpiece of our agenda. And by 2017, when we came really close to taking back the House of Delegates and elected Democrats statewide, all of these people ran their campaigns on Medicaid expansion, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because we had shifted public opinion to understand that this is a really important thing that is going to make people's lives better. And that story shift, that long-term power building work is really what got us across the finish line just to change enough seats to be able to pass it.
I'm back. Sorry about that, y'all. I got my power back. I think I was listening though the whole time. So I think we're down to Maya, who is going to talk about her favorite policy win. So Maya, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Sure. So, so my favorite is, you know, honestly, it was so hard. My favorite was, is driver privilege cards for Virginians, regardless of their immigration status. And I clearly did not say driver's licenses. And that was the hard part. So we went into legislative session with, and I think everyone sort of made references to, like, you know, just because we're in power doesn't mean that everyone's on the same page, right? And everyone's willing to take the same bold steps. And then we have a class of Virginians, right? People who are part of our community, who are taking all of these unnecessary risks in order to get their kids to school and to get to doctor's appointments. And, you know, the one story I remember just so vividly after like years of this fight was listening to a community member talk about how if he had a driver's license, he wouldn't have to take the bus to kidney dialysis and then get back on the bus to try to get to work on time, crossing his fingers the entire time that he wouldn't be late because the buses were delayed or something happened, and then getting back on the bus to try to go get his kids, and then doing that every single day. And that's the one that always sticks with me. And Anna, you were talking about all the stories, but getting to driver privilege cards required all of those stories, right? A lot of people who took a lot of risks to lobby their legislators, to go from Northern Virginia to Richmond. I think about our NVM sister organization, Tenants and Workers United, who put a ton of work into this. And we got to this place where we really thought we could win driver's licenses. And, you know, us, along with numerous coalition partners, we did have some conflicting views on how to get it done. And, you know, there were a number of pressure points. And at one of those points, we realized we didn't have the votes to get actual driver's licenses. And so what happened next? And like I said, there are lots of coalition partners, lots of different ways to get it done. And there were really folks who were like, if we don't get driver's license, we want nothing. And so us as New Virginia Majority, we decided that we really had to go and have some deep conversations with our members, because it wasn't about me or TRAM, right? And it wasn't about some of our organizers. It's really about our community members. And we did have those conversations, and and our members overwhelmingly said, we don't care. If we can drive in Virginia, that's all we want. Even if it's not perfect, we understand the risks. We understand the differences. Let's get this done. And you know, New Virginia Majority and some other organizations really decided to say, to make that public, like, let's just get this done however we can. And again, it's not perfect, and it still feels a little to say that, but our community really wanted that and really needed it. And, you know, hopefully there's more opportunities, like for all of the things that we talked about to make them perfect in the future, right? To get people ready to take those bold steps.
Thanks, Maya. I think the theme here, right, is that we need to make meaningful change for our communities, no matter what, and we need to center our communities in these decisions, and that it's not about the folks that are at the table all the time or the folks that are making the decisions, but if we're going to actually have meaningful policy changes, and we do have to actually be rooted in our communities and bring them into these rooms and to the table as well. And it's also, you know, our work is never finished, right? I think Delegate Price said earlier, we're talking about a 401-year history of, you know, the first, you know, representative democracy legislature in this country's history. And frankly, it's centuries of a system that was built to leave certain people behind. First Black people, now all people of color. And if we're gonna dismantle that system, it's not gonna happen in 1 year. It's not going to happen in 2 years, in 10 years, or 20. This is going to be the work of our lifetimes, right? And we have to take the meaningful change when we can, and commit and double down and triple down to continue the fight. I know we only have about 12 minutes left. We are also, I think others alluded to it, going into a special legislative session next week, where we are going to get to continue the fight, right? We left a lot of work unfinished when we all left the regular session back in April, which also seems like 25 years ago. And so there's work to continue the special session, and then we go back into regular session in January. We have an important election in between, and then we have important elections next year. And like I said at the very top of this conversation, we have elections every year. And so we have a continuous opportunity to continue to fight for the change that we need. So I'm going to give each panelist an opportunity to give your closing remarks, and we will end there. And if folks have any questions, feel free to drop it in the box. And if since we aren't getting to questions, we can certainly answer offline and get back to you. Senator McClellan, I guess I'll start with you again. Closing remarks.
Well, thanks everybody. I think the common theme you hear is how important it is not only to bring voices to the table that have been excluded, but bring the table to those voices. And I think on so many of these bills, what has changed votes is not just an election, although the elections were critical, but the stories that were never told in the halls of power. Someone said to me earlier this year that the people closest to the pain need to be closest to the power. And so we do the work to give them what they need to solve their problems. But sometimes, we're in a position where we know we can't get what we want. So you have to go bold, because if you go halfway and you don't get everything you want, then you've gotten probably nothing. But if you go bold, and you have to step back a little bit. We're all forced, and you heard Maya tell her story. I think all of us have many examples where we didn't get 100% of what we want. And we had to ask, not ourselves, but our communities we were carrying that bill for, is this better than status quo? And if the answer is yes, you take that win, you celebrate that win, but then the next day you keep pushing until you get 100% of what you need. And I think all of us, even though we have elections every year, we have sessions every year, what drives us and keeps us going and keeps us from getting tired is knowing we're making progress every day, but the work isn't done, and we can't stop until it's done.
Thank you. I'm going to go to your left on my screen, which is Anna. So Anna, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think plus one to everything Senator McClellan said. It's hard to emphasize enough just how important it is to make sure that at the center of all of this work, at the center of everything that we do and work for, are the voices of people who that policy change impacts and who the elections are really about, because it's not about any of us. And I am so lucky to get to do this work, to work with such amazing, powerful women, and to get to do this work, to partner with folks who are really, claiming their own power to make change. And, many of you will laugh because I think almost all of you have been on the receiving end of a text from me of, when an elected official leads with somebody's personal story, or, if that's like the hook into a news story, I just get so excited, because like that is the powerful story that we're telling and the voices that we're lifting up. And that's just what keeps me going to be energized for all of the work ahead.
Thanks, Anna. Maya, you're next.
Sure. So also plus one to everything Senator McClellan and Anna just said. I think for me, absolutely remembering and centering people in all of our work. And remembering that it is not about any one individual election. It's about transforming Virginia and our democracy. And really just remembering and being thoughtful that we need to invite people in. Participating in our democracy is hard and it's messy and it shouldn't be. But right now, that's what we've got. And a lot of people don't come in because no one asked them to. And so I think about that, and I really urge people to continue to think about how they're inviting people in and how they're making all of these sometimes mysterious processes accessible to everyone.
Thanks, Maya. Delegate Price?
Oh yeah, I mean, again, ditto to everything that has been said, but I would just add to uplift, protect, follow, listen to, and give credit to women of color who are doing the work. And to those of you all that are on the outside, know that it is your energy and your work on the front lines of the current uprising, while legislators like me get to take bold policy proposals into special session next week to fight for police reform and criminal justice reform in a whole new way than previous years. So keep that up. But it never ends, and you can't build the type of relationships on the inside outside that we've discussed here today while in crisis. Like, this has to be an ongoing year-round relationship and strategizing effort. And the legislators have to continue to have the courage to carry the hard bills. I mean, just, this is hard work. But it does get easier when the outside game is working so hard to center the voices that need to be at the center of these discussions. And so if we're unwavering on work to deliver on the promises that we made to get elected, and the outside is holding us accountable to do those things, we may not get everything, like I said, we may not get everything that we want, but I think Virginia has shown that we can still get some things. And governing is hard, but I think it works best when, like was said, when we extend the invitation of who is at the table. The voices of the communities that will be most impacted by a policy should be at the forefront of those discussions, and their lived experiences should remain the reasons why we continue to fight for the change that we have to make it better for all of us.
Thank you. I'm going to just end by saying that this is such an important conversation, and I'm so glad that we are having it. When we started this work, I mean, for me personally, when I moved back to Virginia and started this work with New Virginia Majority, it was just over like a decade ago. Nobody thought that this was possible, right? Nobody thought that Virginia could be where it is today. When, after the 2008 election and Barack Obama won in Virginia and it went blue in a presidential for the first time in like decades, right? Folks questioned whether or not that was just an Obama wave, or whether or not Virginia was really on the cusp of change. And there were a lot of doubters across the country and even here in Virginia. And I think we proved them wrong. And we proved them wrong because we know as Virginians what was possible here, and we could see, because we lived it, this changing tide, and we kept at it. We all collectively rolled up our sleeves, we engaged people. We are changing the landscape not only here, but we have now shown this country and a lot of states across the South. I have a special place in my heart for our friends and partners in Georgia and Arizona and Florida and Texas and throughout this country, right? We are showing them what's possible. And I hear that all the time. And so for folks who joined this conversation with us this morning, I hope that it was helpful in giving you a glimpse in not only, yes, let's win these elections, but the work is only just beginning after you've won, and that you really have to put in the effort to then win on the policy. And then you also have to make some hard decisions along the way, right? There are lots of hard decisions and hard choices that have to be made, not only by our elected officials in terms of, you know, what bills they carry, what votes they take, but also for us advocates and organizers and community members around, you know, what is meaningful change for our folks and what is just superficial change, and like where do we really put our efforts and our energy. So thank you so much for our amazing women who joined us this morning. Something about having an all women panel just brings joy to my heart, and so I just want to thank them for joining us, and I want to thank you all for being a part of the conversation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Netroots.